The sound of crystal glasses echoed around the dining room as my father lifted yet another glass of whiskey, his smile broad with satisfaction. To achievement, he declared, looking around the table, and to the people who understand the sacrifice it takes to earn it. The room answered with polite laughter and raised glasses. Then, almost inevitably, his eyes settled on me. The warmth in the room disappeared. I quietly took another sip of water, pretending not to notice the familiar disappointment written across his face. It wasn't anything new. In this family, I had long ago accepted my role. I was Oliver Bennett, the son who never seemed to settle down, the brother who couldn't build a respectable career, the black sheep everyone whispered about whenever they thought I wasn't listening. If only they had known where I'd spent my morning. Just hours earlier, I had been sitting inside one of the most secure conference rooms in the Bank of England alongside senior officials, completing the final revisions to an emergency economic recovery strategy designed to keep the country from slipping into financial disaster. None of the people around this table could ever know. Not yet. So, Oliver, my Uncle Richard called from across the room, unable to hide the amusement in his voice, still floating from one job to another. Several relatives smiled before he continued. How long has it been since you've had a proper position? 8 months, my sister Margaret answered before I could speak, adjusting the Cartier bracelet that perfectly matched the lifestyle she loved to display. Although those little consulting projects he keeps mentioning hardly count. A few chuckles circled the table. I calmly continued cutting into my dinner. Those little consulting projects had quietly stabilized multiple financial institutions, reshaped international debt negotiations, and influenced policies affecting millions of people. Ironically, they considered them temporary side jobs. I'm doing fine, I answered simply. My father shook his head. Fine? That's what you call throwing away an Oxford education? He gestured toward my older brother. James built our investment company into one of the most respected firms in the city. Then toward Margaret. She married exceptionally well. Finally, his attention returned to me. And you're still wandering without direction. If only he understood how absurd that sounded. The truth was that, while they believed I lacked purpose, the Prime Minister could reach me faster than almost anyone else in government. Whenever a financial emergency appeared, my phone was among the first to ring. The confidentiality surrounding my work wasn't optional. Every document I touched carried security classifications that prevented me from discussing even the smallest details with friends or family. Their misunderstanding was the price of that responsibility. My mother interrupted the growing silence. Did anyone see today's news about that anonymous government economist? She looked genuinely fascinated. They're saying one advisor may have prevented the recession everyone feared. I kept my expression neutral. The newspapers had started calling me the shadow economist. Editorials debated my identity almost daily. Some claimed I was a veteran Treasury official. Others insisted I had to be a famous academic secretly advising the government. No one guessed the truth. James laughed. Whoever it is must actually know how to commit to something. His glance toward me carried exactly the message he intended. Unlike certain people. At that moment, my phone vibrated inside my jacket. Only one sentence appeared on the encrypted screen. Emergency. Downing Street. 2200 hours. Brussels. Sarah. She served as my direct contact inside the Prime Minister's office. If she marked something as urgent, it meant the situation had already become serious. I stood. I need to leave. My father didn't bother disguising his frustration. Running off again? Another relative muttered something about responsibility. No one imagined I wasn't escaping obligations. I was heading toward one. Within minutes, I was inside my car. The comfortable sweater I'd worn to dinner disappeared, replaced by the tailored navy suit I always kept ready in the back seat for situations exactly like this. 20 minutes later, security officers escorted me through a discreet entrance behind number 10, Downing Street. Inside, the atmosphere was tense. The Prime Minister greeted me immediately. "There you are." His voice carried obvious relief. "The European Central Bank is hesitating. If these negotiations fail tonight, markets will react before opening." He didn't need to explain further. I already understood the consequences. For the next several hours, every screen in the operations room displayed forecasts, currency movements, debt exposure, and emergency projections. Secure video conferences connected us directly with officials in Brussels. Models were adjusted. Scenarios recalculated. Strategies rewritten in real time. Every decimal mattered. Just after 2 o'clock in the morning, agreement was finally reached. The immediate danger had passed. European markets would open without panic. Investors would never know how close everything had come to unraveling. The Prime Minister leaned back with visible exhaustion before smiling. "I honestly don't know what we'd do without you." I allowed myself a small smile. "I'm only doing what I'm here to do." Yet even as everyone congratulated one another, my thoughts drifted somewhere entirely different. Back to my parents' dining room. Back to the sarcastic remarks. Back to the expressions that had become so familiar over the years. The next morning, I finally returned to my modest apartment. The same apartment my family assumed proved I had never accomplished anything. I had barely poured a cup of coffee when my phone rang. "Margaret?" She didn't waste time. Mother and father were worried. Her tone suggested I had committed some terrible offense. "You disappeared without explaining yourself." I glanced toward the newspapers scattered across my desk. Every front page celebrated the overnight stabilization of European markets. Analysts praised the government's rapid response. None of them knew who had actually built the solution. "I'm sorry," I replied. "Something urgent came up." She sighed dramatically. "It always does." Then she changed the subject. "Don't forget the family charity gala next week." That event. Every year, London's business elite filled the ballroom. Executives. Politicians. Bankers. Investors. For my family, it was less about charity than reputation. An annual celebration of status and influence. For years, it had also served another purpose. A stage where my siblings' accomplishments shined while my supposed failures became an unspoken comparison. This year, however, would not unfold like the others. There was one detail nobody in my family knew. The Prime Minister had personally informed me he intended to attend. Not because of my parents. Not because of our family name. Because of me. After years of insisting I remain anonymous, he believed the time had finally come for the architect behind the country's recovery to be publicly acknowledged. "I'll be there," I assured Margaret. I wouldn't miss it. After ending the call, I opened my secure laptop once again. The latest economic reports confirmed everything we'd hoped. Employment numbers continued climbing. International confidence was returning. The pound was gaining strength. Foreign investment was increasing week after week. Months of invisible work were becoming measurable results. Another encrypted notification appeared. This one came directly from the governor of the Bank of England. The latest figures exceed every projection. The Prime Minister is correct. The country deserves to know who has been standing behind these reforms. I walked toward the window overlooking London. Morning traffic was beginning to fill the streets. People hurried to work completely unaware of how close the nation had come to economic collapse only hours earlier. For years, I had allowed the people closest to me to believe I lacked ambition. I accepted every judgment, every comparison, every disappointed look, every label they attached to me. The black sheep, the failure, the son who never lived up to expectations. I carried those assumptions in silence because my work demanded silence. But that silence had an expiration date. In just 1 week, beneath the bright lights of my family's most prestigious event, surrounded by everyone who had spent years measuring success by appearances, the truth would finally walk through the door. And when the Prime Minister arrived, nothing in the Bennett family would ever be the same again. Because the moment the Prime Minister stepped into that ballroom, every assumption my family had clung to for years was about to collapse. The anonymous advisor the newspapers couldn't stop discussing, the economist credited with steering the country through one of its most fragile financial periods, the man government officials refused to identify. That person was the son they had spent years calling their greatest disappointment. I couldn't help smiling as I remembered one particular sentence my father had repeated more times than I cared to count. The boy can't even keep a proper job. The irony was almost unbelievable. Sometimes the person everyone labels the black sheep isn't failing at all. They're simply operating on a level no one else can see. The days leading up to the gala felt unusually slow, as though time itself understood something extraordinary was approaching. Every conversation with my family added another layer of tension. Every sarcastic remark, every disappointed glance, every carefully disguised insult felt like pressure building behind a locked door. Sooner or later, that door would open. I was spending most of my time inside my actual workplace, a highly restricted government floor hidden within Whitehall, an office so confidential that it officially didn't exist on any public directory. Late one morning, my secure phone rang. James. He didn't waste time with greetings. Father wants to make sure you look respectable at the gala. His tone carried the usual mixture of authority and pity. He asked me to lend you one of my older suits. We can't have you arriving dressed like, well, yourself. I lowered my eyes toward the charcoal Tom Ford suit I was already wearing, tailored specifically for me and worth considerably more than my brother imagined. That's generous. And Oliver. He hesitated. Try not to start talking about those consulting jobs of yours. He laughed quietly. The people attending this event are serious professionals. CEOs, chairmen, senior economists. At that exact moment, I happened to be looking through the glass wall of my office toward the Bank of England, where only hours earlier I had finished presenting my latest financial projections to its governing committee. I'll remember that. Oh, one more thing. His voice became even more serious. We've heard the Prime Minister may attend. Another pause. It would probably be best if you stayed out of his way. The last thing this family needs is an embarrassing conversation. After ending the call, I simply placed the phone back on my desk and returned to the live market data covering the screens around me. Currencies. Government bonds. Global risk indicators. Every number represented decisions affecting millions of people. A quiet knock interrupted my concentration. Sarah stepped inside carrying several classified briefing folders. She had watched my unusual double life for years. They still have no idea? I smiled without looking up. They only see the version of me they've already decided exists. She nodded knowingly. Not for much longer. She placed another folder on the desk. The Prime Minister keeps mentioning the gala. I looked at her. He's rearranged part of his international schedule so he can arrive personally. I laughed softly. He's taking this more seriously than I expected. He says some truths deserve a proper audience. That afternoon brought another unavoidable family obligation. Tea with my mother and several of her closest friends. Women who occupied the highest circles of London's business and political society. Before leaving the office, I deliberately exchanged my tailored jacket for an old coat, loosened my tie, and chose a pair of worn shoes from the spare clothes I kept precisely for occasions like these. The performance had become second nature. I arrived several minutes late. My mother's expression immediately fell. "Oh, Oliver." She looked me up and down. "Couldn't you at least make an effort?" Around the table, sympathetic smiles appeared. Not warm smiles. The kind reserved for someone people quietly considered unfortunate. One of her friends looked up from her newspaper. "Has everyone been following the story about the government's mystery economist?" The group immediately became interested. They're saying his latest financial strategy has completely exceeded expectations. Another woman joined in. "My husband insists whoever this advisor is has changed the way policymakers think about economic recovery." Someone else added that foreign governments had begun requesting briefings on the new approach. I stirred my tea quietly. Earlier that morning, I had finished a secure video conference with officials from the United States discussing those very models. Then my mother smoothly redirected the conversation. "Oliver is still searching for the right opportunity." She smiled politely toward the others. "If any of your husbands happen to know of an opening." She hesitated delicately. "Nothing too demanding at first." The women responded with practiced kindness. "I'm sure something suitable will appear." It's difficult for young people these days. You simply have to keep trying. I thanked them politely. There was no point correcting anyone. Just then, my encrypted phone vibrated. Only a few words appeared. Immediate attendance required. Downing Street. Brussels. Again. I stood. "I'm afraid I need to leave." Mother sighed deeply. "Another mysterious meeting?" There was genuine disappointment in her voice. "When are you finally going to settle into a real career?" I apologized, excused myself, and headed for the door. I hadn't even reached my car before James called again. "You humiliated mother." His frustration barely fit through the speaker. "Do you realize Mrs. Henderson's husband is the Chancellor's senior advisor?" I smiled to myself. Only yesterday, I had rejected one of that same advisor's policy proposals during a confidential meeting. "I'm sure he's very capable," I answered calmly. The following days disappeared beneath an avalanche of responsibilities. By daylight, I continued coordinating economic strategy with government departments, central bankers, and international institutions. In between those meetings, my phone filled with increasingly urgent family messages. Margaret reminded me not to forget James's spare suit. Mother begged me to avoid discussing my career. Father informed me that I'd be seated near the back of the ballroom where I would be less visible among the distinguished guests. Each message carried the same unspoken assumption. that I needed protection from embarrassment. If only they knew. The day before the gala, another emergency erupted. A major international financial institution showed signs of instability. If it collapsed, the consequences could spread across Europe within hours. The Prime Minister gathered the senior crisis team immediately. His face revealed the exhaustion everyone felt. "We need a solution before markets open." The room fell silent. For the next 18 hours, we worked almost without stopping. Models evolved. Negotiations unfolded. Emergency funding structures were redesigned. Contingency plans became final decisions. As dawn finally broke across London, the crisis had been contained. Another disaster quietly prevented before the public ever realized how close it had come. I leaned back in my chair, completely drained. My phone displayed countless missed calls from family. Voicemail after voicemail. James demanding to know where I was. Margaret reminding me about the suit. Father questioning whether I cared at all about the family's reputation. I caught my reflection in the dark office window. My shirt was wrinkled. My eyes revealed an entire sleepless night. I looked less like the country's most trusted economic advisor than exactly the unsuccessful son my family imagined. In 12 hours, that illusion would disappear forever. 12 hours until every joke, every comparison, and every disappointed lecture finally made sense. Sarah appeared quietly in the doorway. "The car is waiting." I nodded. "Any changes to tonight?" She smiled. "None." The Prime Minister cleared his schedule personally. She paused before asking one final question. "Are you ready?" I looked once more across the London skyline, remembering every dinner where I had silently accepted criticism, every conversation where I allowed people I loved to misunderstand me, every moment I chose duty over recognition. Then I picked up my jacket. I stopped waiting to be understood a long time ago. A small smile crossed my face. But tonight, I headed toward the elevator. Tonight, they finally meet the man I've really been all along. They had spent years believing they understood exactly who I was. In just a few hours, every certainty they possessed would be turned upside down. The Bennett family's annual charity gala had always been one of London's most anticipated social events, but this year's celebration surpassed anything they had organized before. The ballroom at the Dorchester shimmered beneath towering crystal chandeliers, while extravagant floral displays framed every corner of the room. The tables looked more like works of art than places to dine, each one arranged with fine porcelain, polished silver, and enough elegance to impress even the most demanding guests. I arrived precisely on schedule. James's spare tuxedo, which my family had insisted I borrow, remained untouched in my apartment. Instead, I wore one tailored specifically for me, a suit chosen for state dinners and diplomatic receptions, though no one present knew that. As I stepped through the entrance, several members of the security detail acknowledged me with the slightest nod before immediately returning to their professional expressions. To everyone else, they were simply doing their jobs. None of the guests realized they had been briefed about my arrival hours earlier. "Oliver." Margaret's voice reached me before I had taken more than a few steps. She hurried over, her eyes narrowing as she looked me over. "What are you wearing?" "That's definitely not James's tuxedo." "I found something suitable," I answered with an easy smile, accepting a champagne flute from a passing waiter. Before she could continue, my father appeared beside her. His expression suggested the evening had already become stressful. "You were assigned a table near the back." He lowered his voice. The Chancellor, several banking executives, and other distinguished guests are seated near the front. There's even a chance the Prime Minister will stop by. So I've heard, I replied. He sighed impatiently. Please, Oliver, keep a low profile tonight, and whatever you do, don't start talking about those temporary consulting jobs. This isn't the audience for that. Without waiting for my response, he disappeared into the growing crowd. I glanced discreetly at my phone. A secure message from Sarah appeared. Motorcade arriving in 15 minutes. Everything is in place. The ballroom gradually filled with some of the country's most influential people. Senior bankers, cabinet ministers, business leaders, diplomats, investors, and philanthropists moved from conversation to conversation while photographers documented every handshake. My family looked completely at home. Father enthusiastically described James's latest corporate acquisition to anyone willing to listen. Mother proudly introduced Margaret to guests as though her charitable work alone represented the family's greatest achievement. I wandered quietly through the room, observing. As I passed one gathering, I overheard a familiar topic. They're finally supposed to reveal the identity of that anonymous government economist tonight, one guest whispered excitedly. I've heard the same, another replied. They say he's the architect behind the country's financial turnaround. Someone nearby nodded. My colleagues insist his recommendations completely changed economic policy. Whoever he is, he's earned every bit of the praise. I smiled into my glass. Only a handful of people in the room knew that several of those policies had initially faced fierce opposition before eventually becoming government strategy. At exactly 8:30, the atmosphere shifted. Conversation slowed. Heads turned toward the entrance. The Prime Minister had arrived. My father hurried forward so quickly that he nearly forgot his drink on a nearby table. James and Margaret followed close behind, eager to greet him. Mother stood proudly beside them, convinced this distinguished visit reflected our family's social standing. After greeting several guests, the Prime Minister's chief aide stepped toward the stage. Ladies and gentlemen, the Prime Minister would like to say a few words. The room fell completely silent. My family positioned themselves prominently near the front, smiling confidently as though expecting recognition of their own. The Prime Minister thanked the hosts before addressing the audience. Our country has faced extraordinary financial challenges over the past several years. His voice carried effortlessly across the ballroom. There were moments when recession seemed unavoidable, international markets became dangerously unstable, and banking systems faced unprecedented pressure. Around the room, people nodded solemnly. But because of one exceptional individual whose work has remained confidential until now, we did far more than endure those challenges. He paused. We recovered. Another brief silence settled over the room. We rebuilt. Then another. And today our economy stands stronger than many believed possible. The audience remained captivated. You've likely read countless articles referring to someone the media nicknamed the shadow economist. I noticed several guests leaning forward. The advisor whose recommendations reshaped our economic direction. Another pause. Tonight, I finally have the privilege of introducing him publicly. His gaze moved calmly across the ballroom before stopping exactly where I stood. Oliver. For one suspended moment, nobody moved. Then he smiled. Would you join me? It felt as though every sound disappeared. My father's expression froze. Margaret instinctively loosened her grip on her champagne flute, and it slipped from her fingers, breaking against the polished marble floor. James stared at me in complete disbelief. I began walking toward the stage. Each step seemed impossibly loud inside the silent ballroom. When I reached him, the Prime Minister greeted me warmly before placing a hand on my shoulder. "Thank you," he said into the microphone, "for everything you've done for this country." A wave of astonished whispers spread across the audience. Several guests looked from me to the Prime Minister and back again, trying to understand what they had just witnessed. He continued. "For the past 5 years, Oliver Bennett has served as one of the government's most trusted economic advisors. His work has influenced national policy, guided international negotiations, and provided the framework for reforms now being studied by governments and universities around the world." I could see my mother lowering herself into a chair, visibly overwhelmed. The Prime Minister smiled again. National security required complete confidentiality. That secrecy prevented him from receiving the recognition he deserved, until tonight. He stepped aside, inviting me to the podium. I adjusted the microphone. "Thank you, Prime Minister." I looked across the audience. I'll admit, maintaining complete secrecy became surprisingly easy. A few curious smiles appeared. Mostly because so many people had already decided exactly who I was. Light laughter rippled through the room. My father remained perfectly still. James had already pulled out his phone, scrolling frantically through article after article about the mysterious advisor whose identity had finally been confirmed. A familiar voice interrupted. The Chancellor himself. So those unexplained absences. He looked almost embarrassed. "You were attending government meetings all along?" "In many cases," I answered calmly, including several where we debated economic proposals. A few knowing laughs spread across the audience. I believe we disagreed on more than one occasion. Even the Chancellor smiled. I continued. "The emergency that kept me occupied last night, the same one that prevented me from collecting the tuxedo my brother kindly offered, involved stabilizing an international financial institution before markets opened this morning." Several banking executives exchanged startled looks. Some clearly realized their own organizations had benefited from decisions they never knew I had made. The Prime Minister nodded. "Much of the stability we enjoy today exists because of Oliver's work behind the scenes. His reforms have become a reference point for financial systems far beyond our own borders." Margaret finally found her voice. "So, those consulting meetings," I smiled, "often involved central banks, foreign governments, or heads of state." A ripple of laughter moved through the ballroom. I do appreciate everyone's sincere concern about helping me find an entry-level position. This time the laughter came more freely. Within minutes the evening transformed completely. People who had barely acknowledged me earlier now waited patiently for an opportunity to introduce themselves. Bank executives wanted conversations. Economists wanted discussions. Government officials wanted photographs. Many admitted they had studied papers I had published anonymously, implemented recommendations they never realized came from me, or relied on financial models I had quietly developed years earlier. Meanwhile, across the ballroom, my family remained exactly where they were. Not because anyone asked them to stay, but because none of them yet knew how to step into a reality they had never imagined possible. Within minutes, the direction of the evening had completely changed. The same people who had barely acknowledged my presence earlier were now patiently waiting for a chance to introduce themselves. Executives, ministers, and economists all wanted a conversation. Some insisted they had followed my anonymous research for years. Others admitted they had built strategies around recommendations they never knew came from me. Suddenly, everyone wanted to be connected to the man they had only known as a rumor. Across the ballroom, however, my family remained frozen in place. My father made several attempts to walk over, only to stop halfway each time, as though he couldn't find the words. James looked ready to speak whenever our eyes met, yet every sentence seemed to disappear before it reached his lips. Margaret stood quietly off to one side, still trying to reconcile the brother she thought she knew with the man standing beside the Prime Minister. Eventually, my mother approached. There were tears in her eyes before she even spoke. "Oliver, we never imagined." I offered a gentle smile. "I know." She searched my face, almost hoping to find an explanation that would make the evening feel less unbelievable. "But why didn't you tell us?" I paused before answering. "Because everyone had already decided who I was. That assumption protected the work I had to do, and it also revealed something much more important. None of you ever stopped to ask whether your conclusions were actually true." She lowered her eyes, unable to disagree. As the reception slowly came to an end, the Prime Minister joined me one final time. "You know," he said with a quiet smile, "if you had asked, I could have approved revealing your role years ago." I looked toward my family, who were still gathered together, speaking in hushed voices as they tried to make sense of everything that had happened. "Perhaps," I replied, "but some truths leave a much deeper impression when they're discovered instead of explained." He laughed softly before shaking my hand. "I suppose you're right." A little later, as I prepared to leave, my father finally walked over. For the first time in years, there was no criticism in his voice. Only humility. "Son, we judged you completely wrong." I straightened my jacket and met his eyes. "Not entirely." He looked confused. "You were right about one thing." A faint smile crossed my face. "I never stayed in one job." I let the silence linger for a moment. I was too busy helping run the country's economy. For the first time, he had no reply. The following morning, every major newspaper carried the same extraordinary story. The identity of the government's mysterious economic advisor was finally public, and my phone filled with messages from relatives who suddenly wanted to apologize, reconnect, or pretend they had believed in me all along. But my schedule hadn't changed. While everyone else was talking about the revelation, I was already back inside the secure offices where the real work continued. Markets still opened every morning. Decisions still had to be made. Crises still demanded solutions. Recognition was never the reason I accepted the responsibility. And maybe that's the real lesson. Being called the black sheep doesn't always mean you're heading in the wrong direction. Sometimes it simply means you're walking a path no one else is able to recognize. Until the day your quiet work speaks louder than every judgment ever made against you. And every once in a while, the person everyone underestimated turns out to have been leading the way all along.